We have a question here, and then I'll ask Tim to consider the second top question here. How are issues of water security and temperature increases being integrated into a management framework? So if you think about that, Tim, and we'll take a question from the floor here, and then that question next.
Miles Lockhead from Renewable Recyclers, and we made the centrepieces, and there's a web address on the back if you'd like to contact us. My question is in relation to consumption. The low fruit gains in energy and carbon reduction is tied to consumption, i.e. the consumer, and consumption is intrinsically linked to the growth economy. Please comment.
This is going to be more bad news for David Jones. You just know it, don't you?
I'm not sure that I'm not entirely convinced that the low-hanging fruit all sits with consumption by definition. The consumer. My experience in BP, we introduced an internal emissions trading system, which then drove where we put our energy efficiency investments and things like that, and that actually drove I think an MPV value of something over $1 billion over 5 years. So to the extent that that's internal consumption in an outfit like BP, I suppose that's the sort of supports what you're saying. What was the second half of your question? Sorry.
My comment relates to, and having worked in the waste industry for nearly 20 years and seeing millions of tonnes of good consumer goods thrown away and wasted, and mostly ending up in landfill, our consumption habits are wrong, and the low fruit is in reducing consumption habits and making things last longer. That's what I was getting at.
Yeah, well, I think that applies across the board in industry and actually in the end consumer. But I think it is going to be a two-pronged approach where you're going to have business driving down its consumption of energy, in other words, its emissions of greenhouse gases, driven by investments, and at the same time, when those costs get passed on to consumers, where the emissions can't be reduced, then they will respond by not using as much. I agree. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit out there. The question is, how do you actually find the incentives ultimately for the consumer to make the choices, to have the ability to make a choice? And I would argue today they have a choice, but it's not driven by any external factors. And if you actually put a price in some shape or form on the emissions, then actually ultimately the consumer will then get to have a far more significant play in making a choice than they do today.
Next, Tim, do you just want to take that question? Can we scroll it back up? Is that possible on this board? Here we go. Pull the bar down. How are issues of water security and temperature increases being integrated into a management framework?
Sure. Well, look, I think we have to take a reasonably long-term view of this to see how things are playing out, and remember that, less than a decade ago, our water was a state-based issue. And in that situation, we had states giving away water licences in competition with each other, effectively, in a way that led to gross over-allocation of water in places like the Murray-Darling Basin. We realised that was a problem. We had a decade-long drought that tended to focus people's minds on that issue, and we've now had political reform so that water is now a federal issue, and we are now dealing with trying to buy back sufficient water in the system to make the whole thing sustainable. Now, it's an issue, I think, where we have got, there are significant structural changes that need to be undertaken. We need to make sure that those rural communities particularly remain viable, and the way that things like water buybacks and infrastructure deployment are done is going to be particularly important. And we face some really difficult choices. One option is to spend $5 billion of the money, for example, that's been put into the water buybacks on things like new infrastructure, piping water out to farms and so forth. And that might seem on the surface like a very favourable thing to do, but you've got to think that once you do that, you actually lose water out of the system, because water that's used inefficiently ultimately finds its way back into the river, much of it, because of leakage through the ground table into the sediments and then back into the river. Now that water might come back very dirty, might come back salty and with pesticides or whatever in it, but it is still water in the system. If you use the water efficiently, in other words, make sure it gets to the plants and then is evaporated to the atmosphere, that's water that's lost out of the river system itself. So we have to keep that in mind as we do that. And also keep in mind the opportunity costs, because it may be that if you do spend that $5 billion on infrastructure, that money will go to pipe makers in Melbourne and Sydney and so forth, rather than to the local community news agent or the local community rice mill or whatever it is that could deal with some assistance in terms of upgrading and whatever else. So I think that there's a whole lot of issues we need to consider there. None of it's easy. I would just say that the very wet conditions we've had over the last year or so have given us a bit of a respite in this. But my gut feeling is that those sort of structural water reforms that we initiated under the Howard government will be continuing on for many years yet. I think there'll be a very lively public debate about what the best way to move forward is.
Yeah, hi, my name's Ray Buckley from Sustaining Our Towns. I'd like to pose two questions. The first one's to Jerry and his thoughts on peak oil, and the second one is to the panel. And with an increase in ocean temperatures and an increase in global temperatures, what's the impact on the weather and the wind patterns and the strength of the wind going to be with those increases?
Yeah, just quickly on peak oil, I have to say I don't subscribe to the theory that oil is going to necessarily physically run out and that's going to drive the price up that will then drive demand down. I think what's more likely is that the sort of environmental drivers that we're all talking about will actually drive demand down before oil actually physically runs out. So, for the last 40 years, there's been 40 years of oil available at today's level of consumption. So every year we've managed to replace, through technology or new finds, oil to meet our needs for 40 years out. And there's been virtually no disruption to that as a pattern that's been happening. I think one of the bigger issues that we're facing is you've got the environmental issues on one side, and I think that ultimately will actually drive the demand down. So you're going to get peak demand rather than peak supply. But the other thing going forward is, where is this oil? And a lot of it's been held in the ground, not for technology reasons, but for political reasons. It's also sitting in probably not the most stable places in the world. So, the future oil at the margin is going to be coming from such places as West Africa, the Middle East and Russia. And so energy security becomes one of the key features of, I'm sure, all the policymakers thinking going forward. So in summary, not sure about peak oil actually being potentially the saviour. I think energy security is going to be a big factor, and we could end up with peak demand before we actually end up with peak supply.
Jerry, you're smarter than I am. What was the second half of that question?
Wind.
When? Who? Which? The second half of the question? Give us a keyword.
Wind.
Wind.
Yeah.
Yes. Good on you, Will.
Okay. If you
Smartest man in the room.
Yeah. If you look at it in general, wind speeds will probably go down, and that's because the differential in temperature between the poles and the equator, which basically drives atmospheric circulation, that differential is decreasing because the poles are warming more than the equatorial zones. We actually observed some of this. Wind speeds over the continent of Australia have actually weakened a bit over the past couple decades. However, wind speeds with extreme events may in fact be going up. Tropical cyclones, for example, the intensity's predicted to go up even though the frequency may decrease. East Coast lows may become more intense. Rainfall events are predicted to become more intense. Thunderstorms, hailstorms along the East Coast, this part of the region. Most models agree that they will become more common and more intense, which means that wind speeds associated with isolated events may go up, even though the general wind speed averaged over the continent over a long period of time will probably go down.